Thank you for listening to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast, available on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, and Stitcher. Also, please follow Matt's Movie Reviews on Facebook, YouTube, Parler, and Instagram. And of course, be sure to visit www.mattsmoviereviews.net for the latest reviews, top 10 lists, and more. Now, on to the show.
Right, I just want to say one thing first. Posers must die!
We were out of our minds. We were kind of crazy.
We were just kids.
Kids run amok.
It was scary and it was dark.
It's this outlet for angst. I'm Alex Skolnick, born and raised in Berkeley, California.
Hey, I'm James Hetfield from Metallica.
This is the music you don't want your parents to hear. Gary Holt, David Ellefson, bassist for Megadeth.
I don't need to say my name. Everybody watching this knows who I am.
We're doing it for chicks and beer, and I didn't drink.
My name's Chuck Billy, grew up Dublin, California.
And the pits were violent as hell.
Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 282. Out now on digital and DVD is Murder in the Front Row, a documentary that tells the story of the early 1980s thrash metal movement that began in the San Francisco Bay Area, featuring the likes of Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Exodus, and more. Murder in the Front Row is a head-banging, riff-heavy, guitar-shredding exploration into a monumental movement in the history of heavy metal. Joining me now on the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is the director, Adam Dubin. Adam, I thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Yes, thank you, Matt. It's nice to speak to you.
Likewise.
Yeah, and good to be on your program. I really like your reviews, so thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I really like your movie, and I just had to reach out to you as I watched this. I'm a huge fan of metal, particularly thrash metal. Came across the movie on Amazon Prime, absolutely loved it. Did some research into it. You have a very interesting history. You're a New Yorker, NYU graduate. Your claim, the early claim to fame really was working on music videos. So you had the Beastie Boys videos. You were part of that scene that Rick Rubin was establishing at that time. So I got to ask, the interest in Bay Area thrash, where did that come from? Were you always a thrash metal head when even back then in the early New York days?
Yes, I mean I always enjoyed like hard rock and heavy metal music, but in those early days of the rap scene, sort of while the Bay Area thrash scene was getting going, I was in New York, and we were sort of aware of it, but we were much more involved in the rap scene that was emerging in New York City. And so that was really what was foremost in our minds. And so I was, as you point out, yes, I was a roommate of Rick Rubin, and always, then and now still a friend, and wound up working with him on a lot of different productions that he was doing. And he would work with various groups, and sometimes I would get to do music videos. And so it was sort of a very cool time to kind of be around all that stuff. So I think I understood scenes very well. I understood what it took to make a scene happen. I just came to the Bay Area scene later, and of course, this is a very San Francisco Bay Area based movie, but I'm a Brooklyn born and bred filmmaker myself. So maybe it took an outsider's perspective to see this story the way it needed to be told in this case.
When it comes to that area of San Francisco, and we're talking about places like Berkeley, etc. When people hear these words, hear these locations, like the uninitiated, they think psychedelic rock, and when it comes to Berkeley, jazz and stuff like that. But it became the scene for not only like heavy thrash metal, but it was also kind of like a really kind of popular hardcore punk kind of scene down there as well. How did that environment really create such aggressive music like that?
Well, I think you've hit on something exactly. Whereas the home, Berkeley and the Bay Area before being a home to thrash metal was also a home to psychedelic rock and jazz and the beat poets and all kinds of types of scenes, music, words, whatever that would be seen as on the edge in other places, and in the Bay Area it was accepted. So I think that's what was so interesting about this story, was that the Bay Area itself is actually a very like a fertile ground for, exploring like new musical ideas. So maybe it's not so far-fetched that this heavy music kind of took off there, where it didn't take off in Los Angeles in the same way because something else was happening there. But in the Bay Area, it found a home. And, one of my favorite quotes in the movie is Gary Holt of Exodus and Slayer, when he says, he was talking about all these bands that would then come and play in the Bay Area. And he was saying that, well, if your own area wasn't welcoming of your type of music, we would be. And that was one of the things. Exodus themselves became sort of the ambassadors of the area. Metallica kind of moved through the area. They lived there, but they moved through very quickly because they were kind of conquering the world. But Exodus was like the hometown heroes of the Bay Area scene then and now, actually.
What I really love about your documentary is that, as a film critic and like an avid heavy metal fan, I watch like any metal documentary I get my hands on it, and a lot of them follow that kind of behind the music formula. It focuses on the scandal and all that kind of stuff. Your documentary, what's really cool about it is that it's a movie about these thrash metal guys in their late 50s looking back to their time when they were practically kids. Like everyone forgets, like these guys like 17, 18, 19 years old when they were releasing their first albums. There's a humanity behind it. People in that scene have died. People gave themselves. People sacrificed. How important was it to you to really tap into that element and make that shine in your film?
Yeah, well, thank you, because that really was the heart of what I was trying to get at. As I approached this documentary, I approached it in a way. I never would do films that are like behind the music kind of things. I'm not interested in salacious stuff. And I told this to the people I was coming to interview that look, I'm not here to get like stories about this other kind of salacious stuff, because the real centerpiece of everything is always the music. And so I wanted to find out like who these people were, and who were so passionate. Look, when they were pursuing this music in like the early 1980s, commercial success was the furthest thing away. They're very obviously, if you can play this kind of music, you're a good player in a certain way. You have good technical skills. If you wanted to play commercially and make money, you'd probably be playing some other kind of music. You wouldn't be playing thrash metal. Yeah. So it really is a deep love of the music that kept this small group of people together and supporting it. And so I'm not really that interested in all the other stuff. And what I found actually in making the film is nobody else was that interested in it either. Yeah. They were interested in stories about the music and how that happened. And yeah, sure, there was, there's certainly drinking going on and there's some other things, but it's tangential. It's not essential to it. I think if I was making a documentary maybe about like the if you're making a documentary, let's say about a band like Guns N' Roses or Aerosmith, it seems like the drugs aspect of it is, I guess, more inherent because it's actually in the lyrical content of what's going on. But it's not so much in the heavy metal. The metal was much more about, kind of either sort of having a good time in a way and enjoying life, or about like injustice, or kind of fantasies about like kind of other worlds and things like that. And, I just followed the feel of it and seemed to have gotten that into the film. And it was definitely responded to by the people I interviewed. So that was good. That's what we got there.
When I was watching the film, I was just so incredibly impressed with the number of people you got on camera to talk about it. Because like some documentaries might have one or two people of note, and then like the roadie from like 1986, Metallica Aussie tour kind of thing. This documentary's got everyone, and I mean I mean everyone, I mean everyone. Logistically speaking, how difficult was it to get everyone on camera that way, especially considering that a lot of guys who were based in the Bay Area might not be there anymore? I know, for example, Dave Mustaine is now in, I think, Arizona, and like other people all over the world, and they're touring all the time constantly as well. How hard was it to get people sit down? They're willing, but it's always about that time, isn't it? Finding the time to get it done, get them to sit down and get it on camera.
Well, that's a good point. The story "Murder in the Front Row" of the documentary actually comes from a book of the same name, and it was written, although it's more photographs than it is text, by Brian Liu and Harold Oyman, and they are like original scenesters. They were guys that were there when like Metallica came to town in 1982, and they were there. Of course, they lived there, so they were there before. So they were like the original fans. So what I did was I wanted that voice to be in there just as strongly as Metallica's voice, let's say. So I started by interviewing those early fans and the people who were, who helped build the scene. And like there's like Mark DeVito, the guy who did like a lot of artwork and flyers, and because this is what makes a scene is you sort of need all that support. It's not even just having the musicians. So after I got a bunch of those people who are in the scene, that's when I started reaching out to, what we would call rock stars, musicians. And the first ones to sit were Slayer. And really the first one was Gary Holt, because Gary Holt's still part of the scene. And he feels that. I mean, he lives outside the Bay Area now, not that far, but I mean, he lives outside of it. And but he's still a part of it. Exodus is still a part of that. And so, once I got Slayer, it's just sort of, we went down the line, and what started to come out, you could tell people were talking to each other who were being interviewed, was that they would talk to each other and say, yeah, these guys are good guys. They're telling the story the right way. So by sort of doing the approach that we did, good word kind of, kept rolling along for us and, snowballing and getting more and more people. Now, I've been fortunate to have worked with Metallica for now almost 30 years. Mm-hmm. And so I was, pretty certain they would sit for me. But you just have to work out the timing with those guys. It's obviously Metallica is busy. And so I was very grateful that they gave me time. And in this case, I went to their week-long stay in Mexico City, where they played 3 sold-out shows, and we found the time in there. Mustaine was the one that I was, I really wanted to interview him. I had no relationship with him. I'd never met him before, and I'm fortunate that he was one of the last ones that we got, certainly one of the later ones, and I'm very glad that he decided to sit for us. But that was only because he heard that we were doing, this project the right way. I think a lot of I'm not a journalist. I'm not a music journalist. I'm a documentarian, and I think sometimes when journalists interview him, they pose a question in a way that they look to kind of bait him into getting riled up a little bit and giving some kind of answer that then gets them a headline. And I'm totally not into that. I mean, I really wanted to hear about his music. He's been very open about his drug abuse, but I was not there to talk about that. He's talked about, there's the whole thing about getting kicked out of Metallica. And to me, that's not, it's been told, and I'm not very interested in that. What I am interested in is everything that Dave Mustaine did after he was kicked out of Metallica, which is amazing what he did with starting, from scratch, just starting Megadeth. And of course, he took Megadeth right when it was beginning, right up to the Bay Area with Kerry King intact. So it's sort of an amazing story. And that's what I wanted to tell. And I was very happy that Dave, sat for me as well as David Ellefson, who was just great to talk to. So those guys are really original, thrash metal, creators, and very lucky to have them in the documentary.
I mentioned before the different bands that are associated, and you mentioned just numerous names there, these legendary kind of figures. In the end of watching the documentary, I primarily came away from this movie being about 2 bands especially, Exodus and Metallica. You have the one band that kind of started the scene, and the other one the other band that transcended it. And the link between both of them is Kirk Hammett. And
Yes.
the interesting thing about him is that in a band like Metallica, we have big personalities like James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich. People can get lost in that mix, and I think Kirk Hammett was like that. But to me, it seems, and I was wondering if you agree with this as well, he was such an important figure in that time because he was there doing stuff before Metallica even came on the scene. They came from another part of Los Angeles. How important, Adam, was Kirk in the formation of the thrash metal movement in the early 80s?
Yes, that is a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up because I had numerous people as I toured the movie around and spoke to audiences following the movie. I had a number of times, definitely people were Metallica fans and fans of Exodus and fans of the music, but people would say, I had no idea that Kirk Hammett was so instrumental. And I think that's a beautiful part of the movie because Kirk is, definitely a more quiet guy and humble in his own way. He just doesn't sit there and like talk about this stuff in that way. He just kind of gets out and does this great job of playing music. But what I wanted people to understand, and that's why the story of the documentary starts in around 1979 and 80, is that Kirk Hammett, he didn't even know Lars and James at that time. He was already the guy who was putting together bands. His musical ear was such that he was listening to harder and harder music and playing it faster. So, he was very instrumental in really the creation of thrash metal and what the sound of thrash metal is. And this is all before he ever met Lars and James. Lars and James come to town. They're with this, killer outfit called Metallica, but at that point, Metallica was still an LA band. And, you have what you really have is Kirk watching Metallica and going, wow, these guys are great, and being even on the same bill with Metallica. And so it's really cool to see this kind of mix of people coming together and throw into that, by the way, no small feat is you have the mighty Cliff Burton, of course. And I mean, you've got an amazing amount of talent in the Bay Area, and all these guys are hanging around together. So certainly Kirk was one of the movers and shakers. And I just think as Metallica has gone on, of course, you always hear from Lars in that band, and James Hetfield's the front man, so he's obviously a voice of the band. And right there in the middle, you've always had Kirk Hammett, and what an amazing contribution he's made to Metallica and to the whole movement. So it's great that the movie brings that out.
One of the most bigger than life personalities part of that scene at the time was Paul Bailoff, who was an on and off singer for Exodus, but he was especially there at the beginning. He had a saying that a lot of people in the documentary will bring up now and again. All posers must die. Now, I'm sure a lot of the guys look back at that and just see it as kind of like a youthful, kind of fanatical kind of thing. You're part of the scene, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. But how much of that talks about also the credibility of being a musician, credibility about being an artist at that time as well. Even though these guys were, starting off with their instruments and are playing a different style of music, they were very much talking about real issues. They took their playing seriously. They were very serious about their music. How much did credibility really come into forming this scene and also just taking their stuff, really seriously? And from that context, we have like 4, 5, or 6 bands that are still around today doing what they do.
Yes. Well, it's funny. First, a little story. When I sat down to interview Kirk, the first thing he said was, like, as I'm rolling up, slating up camera, is like, he goes, hold, I've started to pose my first question. And the first thing he said was, well, hold up. He goes, before you get started, I want to say, posers must die. And he points at the camera. And so it was such a great, off the cuff thing that we used it to start the trailer of the movie. And ultimately, it begins the credit sequence of the movie. Something like that is just great. But everybody remembers Paul Bailoff for words like that, for his dedication to heavy metal, and with a good deal of a sense of humor. He never actually killed a poser, but he was a threatening figure in that way. But I think what it really speaks to is something a little more serious, which was, yes, they were very serious about their music, and it was at that time they felt it was us against the world kind of mentality. Thrash music, there was no radio stations that would play them other than, like KUSF, which was a college station. But it was really like they were kind of like the outsiders, so they formed their own kind of community. And so when you do that, I think you very much feel like it's you against the world. By the way, I think the punk community had the same kind of thing on their own thing, which also speaks to the richness of the Bay Area, that at the same time you have a punk movement going on, like in the same kind of Bay Area happening, and occasionally there'd be crossover, but that's how, kind of rich the Bay Area was in musicianship and in like people who wanted to hear new music, that another scene could be happening at that same time. And there probably were some others as well that I don't even know about. So, but Posers Must Die was like kind of the battle cry for those guys. And they seem to have a lot of fun with it. As Gary Holt says again in the movie, he just always says such great things. And he goes, well, if there was posers in the crowd, they were worried that night, So that's kind of part of it. That's part of the lure of the Bay Area, the thrash scene, particularly when it comes to Paul Bailoff, who was a larger than life character.
You also feature different people in it that everyone might not know about. Unlikely allies to these kids, to this scene. One of them that really kind of stuck out to me was Debbie Obono. I think at that time she must have been in her 50s. Yes. She was a music manager. She took on like the more heavier extreme end of the thrash metal. We're talking about like Forbidden Evil and such, and it's quite funny actually looking at the story about her van and how the guys kind of trashed it and their remorse about it as well. But she just was such an unlikely person to help out these kids. What was it about her and her personality that really took these kids? It was a lot of these bands, like their band members at that time. I think Gary Holt mentioned something about like they practically came from the ghetto. They had nothing, which is why they picked up their instruments in the first place. So I guess you could say she was something of a mother figure to the whole scene.
Yes. Debbie Obono. I'd never met Debbie. She passed away approximately 10 years ago. But, as I started to study the story of this Bay Area scene, it was very apparent that it was a very rich story, much beyond even just the music. And so Debbie Obono was one of those fascinating characters. She's there in the photographs. She's obviously older than everybody. I mean, she looks like somebody's mom, and she indeed is a mom. But it's like, who is this lady? What is she doing? And then what you find out very quickly is that she was absolutely beloved by everybody. She was, described as the den mother of the scene, and she took care of these young people. As Alex Skolnick puts it, a lot of people would demonize the youth at that time. There was, it was looked upon as maybe the music is satanic, or it's like whatever the kids are up to, it's like delinquency or something. And she had this much broader view, a beautiful view. She looked at them as like just kids, just trying to, express themselves. And so, as people said, the parties would be at Debbie's house. She would have people all these people could like stay over at her house rather than be out in the street and everything. And she took care of them. She later also became a manager of one of the hardest bands, which is, Forbidden Evil and Possessed. And she managed a number of bands. And, the stories are just amazing that she like went in a van across the country with these bands and, just dealing with a bunch of, adolescent kids who were just raging, and she could handle it. And I heard that she broke up fights at clubs and stuff. I mean, she would wade into it. So this amazing lady that everybody really remembers very fondly. And the other person that I felt was also an amazing person who really helped the scene and an unlikely hero of the scene was a man named Wes Robinson.
Yes.
And Wes's daughter, all these people are deceased now, so Wes's daughter spoke for him, as well as for Debbie Obono. All three of her kids spoke for her. In Wes's case, Wes was a jazz aficionado who ran probably the most important club of the Bay Area thrash scene, which is called Ruthie's Inn. It no longer exists, but at the time, it was like the club. It was like what CBGB's might be to New York punk scene. Ruthie's Inn was like ground zero for this thrash metal movement. Wes didn't own the club, but he ran the club, and he was like a jazz fan, but he heard and saw something in these young people that I think he identified with, at least the fact that the music was on the edge the way it was, and would just start booking thrash metal bands. And so really everybody played through Ruthie's Inn, and the stories are legendary because the mosh pits were insane and the energy and everything. And it was just important. As I said, a scene can only happen if they're supporters of the scene. Yeah. That's why it was so important to me, not just to interview the musicians who obviously played there. Their work is on record, but what's less recorded is the people that actually supported the scene. At least now it's at least recorded. And Wes Robinson's one of those people, Debbie Obono, and certainly many of the other folks who attended the shows and supported the bands in that way.
You are, of course, from New York, Brooklyn, as you said before, Brooklyn born. In your documentary, Murder in the Front Row, there are some people outside of the Bay Area scene in there. Charlie Benatti of Anthrax, the most notable. Could you foresee delving into this material again, but this time focusing on the New York thrash scene? I mean, you have Anthrax, you have Nuclear Assault. You could even throw in like Later Day Carnivore in there. You can Metal Blade Records was situated there as well, and that's when the infamous firing of Dave Mustaine took place up there when they made a big move. I mean, there's a story there to be told as well. Has that ever crossed your mind as well to kind of continue this thrash metal journey, but in a different part of America? Yeah.
Here's the thing. What you start to find out when you delve into this thrash metal scene is that it's actually it's so rich in content that I had a hard time confining it to the 90 minutes that the movie runs. And indeed, on the DVD we put out 90 more minutes of kind of outtakes and stuff, so, equal with the running time of the actual movie. So I had a ton of material. I could have told, if I wanted to keep going, I mean, there's tons of more stories to tell. I stopped at about 1986, but the story goes on both on the East Coast and the West Coast, and indeed around the world, because by 1986 the music had started to really break out all around the world. So my feeling was, I could definitely tell more stories, but I think it's important for other filmmakers to also pick up and do some of these stories. And I'll say, for instance, not just a New York story, but Testament is a fascinating story that could be its own documentary, as well as Death Angels, the other one, I think would be an amazing documentary. Both those bands appear in our film, but in and of themselves, they're amazing stories with amazing musicians involved. And, I mean, if I get a chance, I'll certainly try to continue. I hope to continue telling stories with Metallica. But there's plenty of material for a lot of filmmakers to dig in on these great heavy metal stories, because they're all amazing stuff going on.
And speaking of amazing stuff, Murder in the Front Row, for everyone out there listening, you have to check out this film. If you go, there's actually a website, www.mitfr.com, and it has a section in the website where you can find out where in the world you are. You can locate the film, whether it's on DVD, on Amazon, or on Vimeo. I myself watched it on Amazon Prime. I'm actually in the process, so I think later today I'm going to order myself one of those DVDs and get it shipped to Australia because I want to watch that extra material. I love this film so much, Adam. I think just congratulations to you. I'm really making a not only just a great documentary overall, but something that, like I said, mentioned previously, the heavy metal documentaries, people make all sorts of them. We've watched all of them. This is, to me, one of the finest ones out there, and I had to talk to you about it. And I thank you very much for joining me on the podcast to talk about it.
Thank you, Matt. That's very kind. I'm glad you said that. And I just want to make a shout out that in 2004, I was in Sydney with Metallica at Big Day Out, and I had seriously the greatest time in your country and in your city. And I look forward to coming back there again someday because it was really the most fun I've had. Great times.
It was great times. I was in the crowd, so.
Then we passed each other at some point.
In some point, definitely. I was that was like the second or third time I saw him. I think so. 2004 would have been the Saint Anger. That's when Saint Anger came out and such. So that was a great time, and I absolutely loved your documentary. So Adam, I thank you very much, and everyone, please check it out. www.mitfr.com. Watch this movie. Get into it, and then afterwards make sure you put on your Posers Must Die shirt and bang that head until it can't bang anymore. Adam, I thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Matt. Have a great day.
You too.